Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Spall. So this latest piece of research covered Feb and March this year, and it's really interesting what you've discovered around vaccines, because I think that was the time when the whole AstraZeneca concern was raised, and we put our plans on hold because AstraZeneca didn't seem to work as effectively against the variant dominant here. But it does show, your research, 71% of South Africans say they would get vaccinated if it were available, which I think is quite high compared to other countries. But among the 29% of respondents who were hesitant, a lot of them were younger people, and there was a disproportionately high amount of Afrikaans people who were hesitant. I mean, this is completely fascinating research. Tell us a little bit more.
Sure. So the question that we asked respondents in the NIDS CRAM survey was, if there was a COVID-19 vaccine available, would they take it? And as you say, 71% of respondents said yes, they would. Either they strongly agreed with that statement or they somewhat agreed with the statement. And the remaining 29% either didn't know, or they strongly disagreed, or they somewhat disagreed. And we see higher rates of vaccine hesitancy amongst the youth, as well as those that trust social media as an information source. But thankfully, we see lower rates of hesitancy or higher rates of acceptance amongst those that are at higher risk of COVID-19. So the elderly, those with chronic conditions. So it does seem to be that there's a relationship between how at risk you are of COVID and how willing you are to take the vaccines, as well as some strange trends. As you've mentioned, it was unexpected that we saw trends by language groups where Afrikaans home language respondents had a higher rate of vaccine hesitancy compared to other languages.
It's really interesting, the age demographic, because you're saying that the older you are and the more potential comorbidities, the more likely you are to be willing to take the vaccine. But it's interesting because, speaking to our reporter Heidi Jokos earlier, in Gauteng alone, only a fifth of the 60-plussers who could have registered have so far registered. So the take-up seems fairly low. However, if I'm not mistaken, and you can correct me here, what we're seeing happen in other countries is as your peers start getting inoculated, you realize that it's okay. So then the take-up becomes a little quicker. Do you think the same thing's going to happen here?
So, yes, I also saw that stat. I think the Premier released it, that only just over 200,000 of the Gauteng over 60s had registered to get vaccinated. But it's also important to remember that that was before the rollout of easier to enroll vaccine registration. So now that we have it on USSD, you don't only have to register online or have a computer or internet access to register. They're trying to expand the routes that you can access the registration platform. So I think that will lead to an increase in registration. It's also important to remember that the period that we asked people was in February and March, and that it's possible that things have changed between now and then. But as you say, there is historical evidence and evidence from other countries that as the vaccine campaign rolls out and as people's peers are vaccinated, that people become more willing to accept a vaccine over time. But at some point you start hitting what's called a demand limit. Up in South Africa at the moment, we've been hitting a supply limit. We just don't have vaccines to give people. And I think that only in a few months, maybe 6 months, if the vaccine rollout is very slow, we will start seeing the types of people that we want to get vaccinated aren't coming forward to get vaccinated. And that's what we're trying to alert people to now, so that the government can implement the information campaigns that they need to make sure that everyone does come forward for a vaccine.
Yeah, exactly. So they need to target younger people, and they need to make lots of educational adverts in Afrikaans, it seems. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This is useful research for targeting education campaigns. Speaking of education, you know, we're so worried about a third wave. We've just heard that St. John's College here in Johannesburg has got a small cluster outbreak, with the department confirming a few cases there. We're worried about this third wave, when it's going to hit. But your findings on education and the impact that the lockdown has had on education is really worrying, and it really it gives us more depth. You know, if you look at the pass rate in matric from last year, it was very small reduction in pass rate. But your research suggests that the damage goes so much deeper, doesn't it?
Yes, so we must remember that the matrics were given very special treatment. They were allowed to continue to attend school, and they didn't have to practice rotational timetables. So while the matrics were back at school, all the other kids were at home and missing out on schooling. So for primary school kids, for example, they missed 60% of the school days in 2020, and that was for two reasons. One, because schools were closed in the beginning, but even when they reopened, they practiced rotational timetables where kids could only attend on every second day of the week. Which is actually still being implemented in no-fee schools around the country, and that's having a huge impact on learning losses, which is another thing that we found in the study.
And it's interesting how parents and caregivers' worries about education has actually increased from last year, 52% in November, December last year to 57% in Feb, March this year. That suggests is the longer this uncertainty drags out, the more we're worried that our children are just going to have that massive loss of learning.
Yeah, so I mean, what the Wave 3 data showed at the end of last year is that parents can be both worried and send their children back to school. It's not as if just because they're worried they don't let their children go back to school. And I think that this reveals that schools are about performing such an important function, both for children. Children get free school meals, they learn, but also that if they're not at school, it means that they're at home. So what we've seen in the latest data, which reflected on learning losses, is that for primary school children, they've lost 50 to 75% of a year of learning compared to 2019 cohort, as well as less than half of kids are receiving free school meals because they're only going on every second day. So we have huge ramifications as a result of these rotational timetables, where half of kids are not getting free school meals and they're also not learning. Yeah. And that's going to have very long-term implications for their career prospects and the rest of their schooling career.
Well, let's move on to hunger now and start with child hunger, as you mentioned. We know that the feeding schemes at schools during the deepest times of the pandemic and the lockdown, NGOs had to take government to court to actually really ramp those up while schools were closed. So we are seeing, according to your results, weekly child hunger declined from 16% in November, December to 14% in February, March. However, and this is the thing, we still haven't recovered to pre-pandemic levels.
Yeah, so that's encouraging that we have seen this decline in child hunger, but the new rate, as you mentioned, of 14% is still nearly double what it was before the pandemic. We think it's probably around 8%, but the weekly hunger is such a severe form of hunger that the household surveys that we had before NIDS CRAM didn't even ask about weekly hunger. It asked about whether or not a child in the household had experienced hunger in the last year, whereas we're asking in the last week. So we definitely haven't recovered to pre-pandemic levels. And if anything, we are still seeing the rates that are much, much higher than what we would expect. But these are down to things like the unemployment rates that have gone much higher as a result of the lockdowns and the pandemic, and the school feeding scheme that's not back up to work fully functional.
You know, speaking of hunger and looking generally at food insecurity in homes, this research was done February and March. We know that the end of April, the COVID relief of distress grant ended. Are you concerned that hunger is going to get worse now, or do you think that we're seeing a recovery in our economy to the point that hunger is going to become less and less of a problem?
So I think it's difficult to tell what the trends in hunger will be, because at the same time as we have the removal of that grant, we do hope that the labour market will also recover. So we've got those sort of offsetting effects of people that might become employed or get market income even while they lose grant income. But I do think that it's likely to have an impact on hunger because we know that the social relief of distress grant was reaching at least 10% of households in South Africa that received no other kind of grant. And we know that these are unemployed individuals that are receiving the grant. So I think that does give us strong evidence that removing that grant is likely to put more households and more children into food insecurity, and for many that would lead to long-term consequences, things like stunting, if it's prolonged for a long period of time.
All right, so you've been steeped in this research and you've given us these successive reports. First of all, when is your next tranche of research coming out, and what do you expect to be the biggest worry?
So we currently are just wrapping up wave 5, which is the final wave of NIDS CRAM, and we should be able to release those results at the end of June or early July. And I think the main thing that we're asking about then again is vaccines, but asking additional questions. So asking those that do indicate that they are reluctant to get a vaccine, what are additional reasons why they might be, to try and unpack not just that they are reluctant, but some of the additional reasons why they're reluctant. But I think that it's also really important to understand things like the rotational timetables, the additional costs of lockdown to millions of children that are still ongoing and not receiving proper attention, because while all of the economy has reopened and everyone is not practicing social distancing in taxis, people are wearing masks and going back to work. That's not the case for kids in school. And I think that that's a really underappreciated fact in South Africa, is that millions of children, their long-term consequences are being compromised by the fact that schools are still practicing rotational timetables, and we're likely to see that in the next wave as well.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating. Such important research. Thank you so much.